Welcome back, everybody, to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I'm here with Ilan Kelman and Donald Antenen. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, good. And we are talking climate change today. And this conversation came about, as many of our conversations do, through some sort of back and forth on Twitter, where I tend to take a sort of skeptical perspective towards people who have a sort of unitary focus on climate change as the singular environmental issue to care about. And so Donald chimed in and said, maybe I could play the sort of rube in a conversation about climate change. Somebody who doesn't necessarily follow the literature super closely, but is interested to learn about, what's true, what's false, what's being used for ideological purposes, etc. And so then I thought I should invite Ilan because he is my go-to guy on these topics. And so I will let everybody introduce themselves and then we'll get the conversation started. Ilan, you can go first.
Hello, I'm Ilan. I'm Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London in the United Kingdom, also an Associate Professor at the University of Agder in Southern Norway.
Donald?
I'm Donald. I'm an occasional first-time host of the Doomer Optimism podcast, and I live in Northwest Washington.
Donald has been a host twice and never a guest, although I guess you're kind of a co-hosting with me again today. But our producer accidentally calls him a first-time host every time, so hopefully this time when it comes out it'll be first time.
No, first time every time. Yeah.
And again, this is about hosting each other. It's not expert, non-expert. It's just us working together to learn from each other. And I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on social media, and always ready to engage, to learn and exchange with people, because this is how we improve.
Nice. I love that. Yeah, that's definitely how we treat these conversations. So, okay, I guess I think I want to ask Donald to get started. What is the first burning question you have or thought you want to share? And then we can just sort of all chime in.
Yeah, so throughout this conversation, I want to your expectation for my knowledge should be total ignorance. My first question is, what is climate?
That is actually the best first question that we all have to ask, because if we don't know what we're talking about, how can we have a conversation? And simply put, climate is average weather. That's it. More technically, it is weather statistics calculated over decades. The typical definition has been 30 years, but that's not fixed. Some people have used 50 years in the past, and there are many advocating to make it 20 years. But it is a nebulous concept. Many languages and cultures do not differentiate between climate and weather, or they've more than two words. But really, climate is an abstract statistical construct which simply says we experience weather, we step outside, we feel rain, we feel snow, we feel the temperature, we feel the wind. Take those data, average them over some length of time, and we get this strange word, which in English we call climate.
So that almost makes sense to me, I think. For a particular place, a particular place you could take weather over time, and I guess what average the rainfall or the temperature or something. Then what does global climate mean?
Simply averaging that over the entire globe. So if one location is at a certain temperature, say you're in Washington, what's the temperature there today?
I don't know, 69 or something.
Which is Fahrenheit. So I don't know, let's do random math. Let's call it 17 Celsius. Let's say London is at 60 Fahrenheit, or randomly, I don't know, call it 15 Celsius. Again, these conversions are not straightforward. So we take the temperature over each point in the globe, do an average, and that gives us the global temperature. So when we're looking over time, we take the temperature measurements in many places at many different times, average them, and that gives us an approximate value for global temperature.
Do you have a follow-up, Donald? Because I have a quick question then.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't
Or
think
Donald, no,
I
if it
don't
doesn't
I
make, if
don't
it
think
doesn't
that
make sense,
actually
say
makes
so.
any sense to me at all.
It
Like just
doesn't make
thinking
sense.
locally, just thinking locally of my own place, we have microclimates.
Yeah.
So even to talk about the average temperature in the place that I live, you would come up with a number which no one actually experiences. So it's a number that has no relation to any lived experience of anyone, and doesn't actually reflect the place at all. And so when expanding that out to the whole globe reaches a level of abstraction that is just several orders of magnitude beyond what I can comprehend, but also seems to strangely come up with a series of numbers that has no connection to any place or the life of anyone.
You're absolutely right. This is a challenge. It is a huge abstraction just for global average temperature. And then we average that over time to get another level of abstraction for climate. So what does it mean for lived experience? And often, as you're saying, it does not mean a lot. There are some conclusions we can draw. So if the global average temperature of Earth was minus 40 Fahrenheit, same as minus 40 Celsius, human life would be very difficult. If the global average temperature were plus 50 degrees Celsius, then human life would be very difficult. What we know is by getting this global average temperature number is that we can live here, and that's helpful. It also gives us some mechanism for understanding what can the environment do, what does it mean overall. But when we look at lived experiences, exactly as you're saying, overall may not be good enough. You know, it's a standard that if you put your head in the oven and turn it on and put your feet in the freezer, your average body temperature may be fine, but you're dead. So what is the meaning of that average? It's even more complicated because mathematics actually has different types of averages. So it is an abstraction. Some general conclusions can be drawn, but what it means for people, what it means for lived experience is very much a separation between these numbers and these concepts that don't even exist in some languages compared to what does it mean for people day to day? How do they live? How do they want to live? And what sort of resources, opportunities do they need to ensure that, for example, they don't get killed by the cold or by the hot?
I have a quick question, maybe clarifying background information. So a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is this exact thing Donald's bringing up, which is there are people for whom abstraction is like the main guiding force of their lives or work or policy making. And then there are other people who get extremely frustrated by that because the abstraction has almost no bearing in their actual reality and day to day. So when somebody who's dealing at such a level of abstraction of global climate science is telling, somebody on the ground, this is the actual reality as it is, when the person doesn't match with their lived experience, there's a disconnect. And then there's like a whole bunch of cultural differences that emerge from that. So one point of background I'd be curious to hear from you, Ilan, is the history of this. Like, do you know much about how climate science came about? Maybe a very brief, like, how did it develop over time, and how is it used in the current moment?
I mean, to some degree, it's something which people have written books on. And then it's a question, right back to what you're saying, Ashley, and of course, Donald's fundament. Even if we do produce that history, is it meaningful? Is it useful? But ultimately, science is trying to generate knowledge. It's a search for explanations. And for some people, they'll say, well, what's happening to me now? What's happening here? Stick a thermometer out the window or step outside and you get that temperature. Others will say, well, what's happening here may not be what's happening elsewhere. So can I get more of an overall picture? Can I understand what's happening in my entire area? If I want a larger farm, can I have something to describe what's happening in the air So I know how to plant that farm. And then we get average temperature over an area. And still others will be even more curious and say, well, if I can average it over my farm, can I average it over larger areas like the globe? And so we start developing the mathematics for it, which is abstract. We start developing the words and the ideas for it, and then end up with these concepts like climate or like global average temperature. And it helps to generate knowledge. It helps to explain major climate and weather influences which do happen at very large scales, like huge rivers of wind high in the atmosphere, or huge ocean currents, which basically circulate the globe. But what does that mean for lived experience? Is that useful? Well, I mean, I'd bounce that back to you, Donald. Has this helped? Do you want more explanation? Is there anything I should go deeper in, or something I'm saying that just doesn't make sense?
How is the global average temperature measured? Like, are there, I don't know, are they taking data from local meteorologists and then compiling it all? Are there buoys out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you know, with thermometers on them, beaming it up to a satellite or something? What's the actual process by which it's gathered, and who determines what the point? Obviously, you can't have a thermometer on every square mile of Earth. So who determines where measurements are taken? It seems like such a huge enterprise. Who's actually doing this?
Part of it is exactly what you're saying. We have a lot of people, whether it's scientists or airport managers or farmers, who in effect stick that thermometer outside the window or go outside with the thermometer, and then we aggregate, we bring together all those measurements. But it's not just about specifically what do all these thermometers say. It's also recognizing that we have ways of approximating or estimating what is going on in the global average through mathematical techniques. So with a certain number of measurements, which can be verified, and then we have to look at the ranges or what's called error bars, because no measurement is perfect, we can then use mathematical techniques to say that approximately, or as an estimation, we think this is happening in other places, work out what would be about an even distribution of temperatures, and then calculate up to the global average. Again, that number is often given as a number, but it does have a range of values. It does have what's called possible errors. And the word error in English tends to mean mistake. Oops, that was an error. I shouldn't have done that. Let me correct it. In this sense, the word error is used somewhat differently, in that mathematical error is more a range of numbers in which the real value very likely falls. But because we have so much data on temperature from around the world, and because the mathematical techniques are very refined, that error or that range and what we call global average temperature is very small. And we have a very high confidence regarding what is happening to that number as we go through the years.
Could you give us a brief introduction to the mathematics?
Probably not the best, because when we're dealing with words like climate, again, it's an abstraction anyway. So to start with the basic mathematics and introduce different types of averages, I may not be the best for it. And I'm trying to avoid too much confusion.
Yeah, sure. So is this the kind of thing a human being can sit down and do the equations, or is this already in the level of like supercomputers crunching?
No, it's
numbers?
fairly standard. It's fairly standard mathematics.
Okay.
But I'm well aware that the majority of people don't have the basic statistical vocabulary. Don't, you know, if I say y equals mx plus b, does that mean anything to you?
To me? No.
Yeah, that's why.
I remember that from high school.
Okay. So yeah, to get that level, like I say, I'm probably not the best for it, but it's probably not that helpful because it will require a certain level of basic mathematics, which would take a while to explain, and I might lose you completely, which is not my purpose here.
Okay, I've got a quick follow-up. So I think my sense as somebody who definitely feels like, you know, the climate is changing and that humans have had activities that have impacted global climate. I also have the sense that climate science, this is my and I'm not, I don't look at the literature super closely. I'm a qualitative researcher. So I don't look into the mathematical models, but my sense is that it's so complicated. There seems to be pretty large error terms and or a lot that climate scientists can't predict, and juxtapose that with the certainty with which a lot of environmentalists talk about climate, like this is totally baked in, this is absolutely going to happen, and then other people say, you know, maybe it's not, there's some unknowns, there's unknown things where, you know, if one impact happens in one part of the world, it can have cascading effects on the climate and the environment all over the world, this kind of thing. So my question for you is, do you think that there is, you know, like how confident are you in the precision of this currently at the state of it right now? Because I know the IPCC report is coming out every single year. It's trying to get more and more precision and or, you know, more information out to people. But I know you've been critical of just the project in general, as in, you know, almost like we're describing with more and more precision that we need to change, but it doesn't seem to be making any political change. We can talk about that separately, but I'm curious your sense of like how precise is climate science and the kind of expectations of what's supposed to happen in the future. How sure are those?
We are absolutely confident that we are changing the global climate rapidly and substantively, that we are absolutely competent that has significant ramifications at that local level. When Donald just says, well, what's the temperature here now, when we step outside with a thermometer? And we are absolutely confident that we are going to be slammed. In fact, we are being slammed, particularly by heat humidity, to the point that it gets beyond human survival. Beyond that, there are significant nuances, subtleties, and provisos. There's always a lot of discussion and a lot of debate, and plenty of uncertainties. Within what you just said, Ashley, I mean, so important, and this is the fundamentals, but there are also a lot of issues to sort of query, should we articulate them this way, this is appropriate? So in a sense, I'd like to return to Donald and say, do these questions help? Do you want me to address them? Anything in particular that would help you, Donald?
I'm curious about the concept of attribution. So I'm still not sure that I understand the abstraction of global climate or average temperature, but I'm just going to put those aside because I think that might just be my inability to think on that scale, or my refusal to think on that scale. I'm not sure which one it is. Maybe my refusal has shaded into inability.
No, but that's fair. So if I say
like
climate,
cultivated ignorance.
If I say climate, what does that mean to
you? Maybe, you know, like temperate, arid. You know, the different regions have a kind of general feel to them. I suppose that's my.
Okay, could you think that maybe the globe, the Earth, has a general feel to it?
No.
Why not? Why a region but not the planet?
Oh, I mean, because you can't feel the Earth. I mean, it's impossible to have a general feel of the Earth. I mean, you could be, someone can be standing in the Arctic and another person in the Sahara. So it doesn't make any sense to me that it cannot have a feel, because it's impossible for us. You know, we're just not large enough to feel something at that scale. So
yeah,
no.
That makes sense. So maybe we shouldn't talk about climate change. We should talk about humans rapidly affecting the weather. And if I say to you, you're in Washington, you're going to experience heat waves beyond the human ability to survive. Does that make sense?
on some level, I suppose, but it makes sense in the same level as saying, talking about an invasion of extraterrestrials or something. Like I can imagine sort of apocalyptic disaster, I suppose, but
Are you ready for an earthquake?
am I ready for an earthquake? Actually, I am.
Okay.
Earthquakes are pretty common, though I'm not in particular danger, but my mother-in-law got into like an earthquake preparation, went on an earthquake preparation kick for a while, so we're ready.
Okay, are you ready for a heat wave?
Yeah, we had one last year, but it's been quite cool this year. So I don't know.
Okay, so what temperature?
But I'm not ready for a heat wave beyond the ability for humans to survive, because I think by definition that would just kill them.
Well, yes, absolutely, that's the issue. But if we stick with Fahrenheit, at what temperature is it too hot for you?
At what temperature is it too hot for me?
Depend on humidity somewhat.
Yeah, heat, humidity. I mean, however you want to articulate it.
I lived briefly in a tent in New Orleans, and that was pretty much my upper limit, I have to say.
Like 95 and extreme.
Yes, like 95 and 100% humidity. Yeah, that was horrible.
Okay, I'll give you triple digits and 100% humidity. What would you do?
What would I do? I don't know. I guess I'd just spend a lot of time in the water.
And at the point where it's almost too hot for you to stay in the water and feel comfortable, then what?
I don't know. Pray, I guess. I mean, I mean, I suppose this is like a similar line of questioning of like, you know, like what would you do if your house is on fire? What would you do? Like run through various like disaster preparation. So the kind of thing you're describing of temperatures increasing to the point where human life is no longer sustainable doesn't seem to me something actually one can prepare for.
It is a big challenge, and you've actually hit it. There's not a lot we can do. So if we accept what you just said, at that point, how do we prepare? Would you think it's better to prevent?
Well, I mean, this is like saying, would it be better if your children didn't drown? I mean, obviously everyone would say, yes, it is better for it not to be, the temperatures to be so high that human life can't go on. There isn't a single person who wouldn't say yes to that. But that seems several steps down the road from where I think we had to, at least in this conversation, we're not to the point, I think, where at least where I understand what we were talking about earlier with global climate and average temperature, to talking about temperatures so high that human beings are roasting alive or whatever. So maybe we could to go back to my sort of baseline questions. I'm curious about attribution. So if I accept temporarily these abstractions of global climate and average temperature, I'm curious how those things and changes in those things are attributed to how they're attributed, like how we determine the causes of them.
The causes of what specifically?
Changes in average global temperature, for example.
Oh, okay. Because climate is weather statistics. So climate is actually the derivative of weather. It's not the other way around.
I understand. So I'm curious how, let's say scientists are saying, okay, climate is changing in such and such a way. What are those changes? How are those changes attributed? Like to what are those changes attributed, and how does that attribution happen?
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is
maybe I'm not using the right language, but
no.
that's my question.
Why do the weather statistics change? And there are many natural causes. So we know that the Earth moves in its orbit around the sun. That changes the amount of heat that the Earth gets from the sun, which then affects heat and cold. We know that the Earth wobbles while it's moving around the sun. So the Earth is rotating around an axis, a line. That axis moves, which means that the planet, a point on the planet is moving with it. And so if you're here and the axis is moving, you will get less heat from the sun. And then when it goes that way, you get more heat from the sun. So that's an example of a long-term natural change, which affects how much heat from the sun statistics. That's one example of natural changes. An example of an artificial change is when we build a city. So when we put a lot of skyscrapers, high rises up there, when we have a lot of heat generated in order to let people live in their houses or work in their offices, some of that heat radiates. The high rises, the skyscrapers also change how the air flows. And ultimately, we're adding more heat locally, which is called an urban heat island, for obvious reasons, I hope. And as we add that heat locally, the local temperature goes up. So that's an example of how we attribute local increases in temperature to our activities. When we're talking about what we mean by climate change today, we know that there are gases in the atmosphere which let the incoming sun's radiation go through and hit the Earth. But then when it comes off the Earth, it's at a different wavelength. It's a different type of radiation. And those gases trap that radiation coming off the Earth. So rather than coming in and going out, it comes in and then some gets stopped. Those gases, those molecules absorbing that heat is by definition an increase in temperature. And so when those gases in the atmosphere are absorbing the heat, the air gets hotter, and that's the rise in temperature that we observe at the global level. And that's what we call human-caused climate change today. Now, how we take that abstraction and move it down to you, we can see it, and we're seeing it today. So yeah, I fully accept and understand the difficulty of saying, what does climate mean when some languages don't have the word? And particularly at the global level, how can we even understand? How can we even think, as you're saying, you know, the Arctic is below zero, the tropics are quite broiling. So what does it really mean? And it's an abstraction, as you're saying. So let's bring it down to the local level. Just north of you is British Columbia. Last July 2021, there was a heat wave and over 600 people died. Some of those temperatures were basically non-survivable without artificial cooling. And those temperatures do appear to be quite in excess of what we would expect under only natural changes. So that is, if we were not changing the atmosphere at the rate we are changing it, then the heat and humidity in British Columbia would not have been that high, and the death toll would have been lower. So that's a direct example, which again, you need to tell me if it works, that people north of you died because we are heating the atmosphere. Does that bring it down to an understandable level, or am I still missing the point?
I don't know.
Well, what don't you know?
Another question, if I could. Sorry, I'm curious how, maybe this isn't actually how people think about it, but what the climate would look like if the Industrial Revolution had never happened.
Yes, we know that through models, and a rough estimate, because the numbers change, but as a rough estimate, we would probably be on a slight downward cooling trend at this point compared to the peak temperature over the last 100 to 200 years. So we would not be getting that heat wave that we saw in British Columbia. It would have been several degrees cooler. And what we saw in India and Pakistan recently, the local temperatures that people were experiencing would have been several degrees cooler. As another practical example, what we know through the physics, through observations, through modeling, is that hurricanes are declining in numbers because of what we are doing to the global climate. So we are looking at fewer hurricanes because of human-caused climate change. But when a hurricane forms, it's much stronger, it's more intense. So if we take Hurricane Laura, for example, which hit the Gulf Coast recently, there may have been more hurricanes in that season without us changing the climate, but they would have been slightly weaker. And it does appear that Hurricane Laura may have had, as a rough estimate, it's a bit of a guess, maybe 10, 20, 30 kilometers per hour more stronger winds than it would have without. So, whatever, 20 miles per hour stronger winds than without human-caused climate change. So that's where we can look at a specific hurricane and say, well, we would have expected more hurricanes without us changing the climate, but each one would have likely been weaker. So that hopefully, you tell me, is that more tangible? Is that more direct? That you're sitting in New Orleans as you were, you expect more hurricanes, but weaker ones if we were not changing the climate? Does that help?
Well, all the tangible examples you give make sense, but the connection to the large abstraction, I think, is temperamentally difficult for me to make. I just so I'm
that. Yeah, no, which is why it's helpful to say, well, what makes sense to you? And if we do not use the word climate, I'm happy with that.
Maybe I can jump in for a moment. One thing that I love about your research and writing popularly is you will push back against some catastrophizing language which attributes everything in the world to climate change, every possible environmental disaster. And I wonder if you might list off some of the common ones. I know hurricanes are one where people are saying we're getting more and stronger, and you say, well, that's not what, at least if we're going to believe these abstract climate models, let's at least believe the scientists as they're telling us what's actually changing, what they're actually finding. Wildfires is another one. So I'm wondering if you might tell us a few misconceptions that are commonly attributed to climate change that might be a host of other environmental issues and or just inaccurately attributed to climate change.
Even the earthquake in Afghanistan last week, people were saying, oh, this is climate change. This is what climate change is bringing us. And no, what we are looking at in the long term is there are possible global influences from the changing climate to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. But to Donald's point of attribution, to take an earthquake, to take a volcanic eruption and say this is climate change, we cannot do that. And certainly that earthquake in Afghanistan was moderate. And so no matter what climate change is or is not doing to tectonics, earthquakes and volcanoes, these are the sorts of earthquakes that Afghanistan experiences. So when we're looking at these issues, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, it is misattributing them to climate change. Storms we've talked about, and it's actually the same with storms in the Arctic, which are called polar lows. So they're basically Arctic hurricanes. And in some areas, it appears that climate change is not affecting the numbers. In other places, it is decreasing the numbers of polar lows. But again, when one forms, it is more intense because there's more energy driving that system. Fires are very difficult. Because we're heating the atmosphere and we're changing the humidity, what they call fire weather is getting worse in the same way that heat waves are. So if we're looking at intensity, duration, numbers of days with fire potential, those are all increasing. to get a fire, a wildfire, a bushfire, a vegetation fire, there has to be an ignition source. And the main natural one is lightning. What is happening to lightning because of human-caused climate change is highly localized. And the initial model suggested there were general increases. Now it's actually not so clear, particularly at the local level. Many fires, though, unfortunately, are caused by humans. Discarded cigarette, motorcycle or car backfiring, unfortunately arson, slow burning coal fires, which we think may have contributed to the Marshall Fire in Colorado in December. People not putting out campfires, people burning garbage.
I might
So
add to that, that another thing that I'm increasingly aware of as I'm interested in regenerative land management is this topic of planned burns for underbrush in forests were like a common way of managing land when indigenous populations before the settlers arrived in North America, for example. And a lot of those practices went away, including having ruminants within forests like bison herds, et cetera. So I think there's a whole host of other land management practices too that I think people don't really even start to think about. And the first thought is always climate change. Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add to the list.
No, that was
and if you're
absolutely
interested
brilliant.
in that subject, I interviewed James Pogue on the Doomer Optimism podcast, and he talked a bit about the sad story of forest management in the American West.
Yes. Highly
mismanagement.
Yes. And so, okay, so to turn it, to try to bring together these, your concerns, Donald, and this, this part of the conversation that we just turned to, I'm kind of interested in the kind of disconnect between climate scientists and the people who almost dedicate their lives to solving the issue of climate change, which in my opinion sometimes turns into very strange and or counterintuitive or anti-helpful solutions. Some of those solutions include, God, what was it the other day? Somebody was saying, the science tells us that we need to do industrial agriculture, don't have a garden because that's a misuse of your climate energy. I don't even remember what the argument was. I think it was something like your internal calorie usage for having a garden is a misuse of
it's inefficient. It's
inefficient relative to industrial agriculture. And this is the opposite of what I argue for, which is, you know, smaller scale and ecological or regenerative agricultural production. So sometimes there's this disconnect where people who are sort of focused on to the ignoring local truths, or, you know, I don't know, the material reality in favor of globalized, highly abstract numbers, can come up with really strange solutions. And so to talk about this disconnect between what Donald is talking about and these climate scientist numbers and climate change activists, maybe the first entree into that part of the discussion could be a discussion about the IPCC, which I personally think it's called the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's a bunch of climate scientists who are at the top of their game and, you know, highly respected, but they get together and use a huge amount of energy, time, resources to put out this report every year. And it basically just says, like, in more detail or the same detail, or, you know, updated detail each year, things are getting bad, we need to make a change. And I personally wonder, and I know you've said this too, Ilan, like, you know, how are we to best use our resources here? And if we're trying to get people like Donald on board, and I know a bunch of people like this who are literally in their localities doing highly ecological work, but feel disconnected from the world of climate science because of this sort of focus on the abstract and the global and the data-driven, spreadsheet-driven solutions. And on the ground, those spreadsheet-driven solutions don't make sense for their lives. So let's start that part of the conversation, I think would be useful.
Well, let's learn from Donald about what he's doing locally. And of course, you, Ashley, I mean, your amazing work and what you're doing locally, and that transitions up to global, inspiring the world. And let's stop talking about climate. Why use an acronym like IPCC? Even the phrase Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, does that have any meaning? Why talk about it in the first place?
Well, the reason I bring it up, and maybe Donald, I want to let you jump in here, but the reason I bring it up is because in my experience, the kind of things that I advocate for are considered either fringe or certainly not getting like headlining news in the Nation or New Yorker magazine or something like that. And so the reason I bring up that way of thinking is because I think it gets a lot of attention, a lot of media, and I think it's worthwhile to at least state the shortcomings before talking about like the alternatives to it. I don't know, Donald, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm still curious to try to figure this stuff out.
Okay, we can go back to that.
So do you think we're on a trajectory? So, okay, and I think this is all going to come together.
Okay.
Actually, it's all going to come together.
Okay, go for it. I trust you.
Okay, so do you really believe that at the current trajectory we're on, that temperatures are going to make human life, very difficult or impossible?
It's not what I think, it's not what I believe, it's what the science says.
Okay, and at what time scale?
It's not that they're going to make life difficult or impossible, they are now, as in British Columbia last year, India, Pakistan over the past few weeks.
Okay, and at what time scale does that become sort of generalized? Because like British Columbia, I think like probably net population, more people are moving there now than moving away. So there's not like life in British Columbia is still like a very affluent, livable place. There aren't mass migrations of people heading north where it's cooler in Canada. Like northern British Columbia is extremely unpopulated. Like most of Alaska is extremely unpopulated. There's huge stretches of northern Canada that almost no one lives in. And so I guess I'm curious like what your time scale is for this really setting in and these places being uninhabitable.
There are few people living in specific locations in the places you mentioned, but it's not uninhabited and it's not divorced from the people who know the land and who've been there for over 10,000 years. So the fact that there is not a town with a name, or there's not 1 million people living there, does not preclude the land and the life there having intense meaning.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. I'm not saying that there's no one there. I just mean that the vast majority of people in British Columbia are living in Vancouver and the surrounding area. And so for those people, it clearly is still very livable. There were deaths in the summer. And then I think in a lot of places, there are deaths from heat every summer and have been for a really long time, maybe always. But I'm just curious about your time scale here for like, is there going to be a mass migration of people north into cooler climates in Canada at some point, like what the time scale is here, because that clearly isn't happening now.
Well, there's a difference in responses. So migration, it depends whether or not people have the resources and want to move. Mm-hmm. Some people will say, well, I don't accept it, or I'd rather die than move. And heat waves, of course, have been happening since the dawn of humanity. So it's not that 100% of deaths are attributed to human-caused climate change from that heat wave. What we are calculating now, I mean, not me personally, but colleagues, are looking at the percent which can be attributed. And some calculations for the UK, for example, are suggesting that on the order of 20%, 1/5 of heat humidity related deaths at the moment can be attributed to human-caused climate change. So that is, we've always had heat waves. And in fact, in 2003, maybe 20,000 people died in the heat wave in the UK, maybe 2 or 3 times that across Europe. But what we're looking at now is when we do get a heat wave, and perhaps there's 200 dead or 2,000 dead, about 20% of those would not have happened without climate change. So in Europe at the moment, we are seeing temperatures in excess of 40 degrees Celsius with high humidity. That is really getting to the point of non-survivability. And once we tally up the deaths, once we know how many died, then we will be able to do a calculation about how many of those, not 100%, but how many are attributable to human-caused climate change. There are confounding factors. One of the groups most vulnerable to death in heat, in high heat and humidity, are the elderly. Since March 2020, we've seen significant excess death rates in the elderly because of COVID-19. So even where we are able to attribute the heat, humidity deaths to climate change, they will probably be fewer than expected because we can only die once each. And unfortunately, we killed a lot of people in COVID-19. These are the mathematical challenges in working out what's going on. But who chooses to move are those who can afford it and have the options. Those who cannot afford it, who cannot afford, who are not able to move, end up trapped. And yeah, they are the ones who end up dying. At the moment, we're not having significant power outages in heat waves. You know, it's happened for over a generation in North America, where people assume they can have fans or air conditioning, but everyone switches it on when it gets hot and the power goes out. But if it's for 2 or 3 hours, they can manage. If we're talking 2 or 3 weeks, then we start to see high mortality. South Africa at the moment has what they call load shedding. They actually have, I think in California, it's called rolling brownouts. Is that a phrase that sounds familiar? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's the same sort of thing where you know the power is going to go out for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours simply to avoid overloading the system. So as it gets increasingly hot and humid, which lasts for longer, if we are unable to increase our energy supply, which is unlikely because that costs a lot, then suddenly those people who can afford air conditioning no longer have it. And then, of course, we see deaths spiking. Sometimes we get a huge daily variation. So it may be hitting that, 120 Fahrenheit, if that's possible, 110, 130 Fahrenheit. But if it's only a couple of hours and you can relax and drink water and sit in the shade, if it then drops to the 80 Fahrenheit in the evening, your mortality really declines because people are able to recover. But if you're not getting below those triple digits in the evening, or if people are forced to work outdoors in the heat of the day, they're going to die. And we're talking about agricultural workers, which is our food supply. We're talking about construction workers. And we're also talking about when people go and buy their $5 t-shirt to wear twice and then discard, we're talking about the people who made that, the indoor garment factory workers who there's no airflow. They're there for 12, 14, 16 hours with very few breaks, and they don't have clean water in order to hydrate. So those are the people who are dying. It's not when do we predict this or project that this will happen in the future. This is happening now.
May I just jump in? Wait, hold on. I just want to make one addendum, but then you can go. I think that the thing that I just want to say here is that all of that you described, though, is not just climate change. It's like electricity infrastructure. It's like the whole infrastructure of building our society around cheap energy, no installation. Nobody has like, there's no passive solar construction that keeps people cool. Like basically everything about our lives is not ecologically sound. And so I think it's really important, at least from my perspective, to think holistically about this, because if we say something like, and I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but if you say something like there's really hot temperatures and it's all climate change, and therefore all these people are going to suffer, people aren't thinking about all those steps in between, like that could make us more resilient on a day-to-day basis, that include, updating the electricity grid, making it renewable, updating homes, making them insulated, all of these different actual tangible things we can do. So, but Donald, go ahead.
No, but you're right, Ashley. This is what we need the discussion about.
So, I mean, humans lived in Mississippi, Louisiana, Southern Georgia, Texas, including the elderly, without electricity. And it seems like a long way for British Columbia or Northwest Washington to have climates anything resembling those places in terms of heat and humidity. But I'm curious, like today, if you look at where older Canadians move, lots of them are moving to Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida. If you look at cities that are growing in the United States, like Las Vegas has grown substantially over the last decades, that people are still moving to warmer places when they have the means and ability to move. There doesn't seem to be any large-scale migration to colder climates, certainly not in Canada. And so I guess that's what I'm curious about, the timescale you're describing, and then also connecting in terms of what people are doing, is in terms of actual human activity, mass human activity. There doesn't seem to be any, like mass human behavior doesn't seem to reflect at all the idea that these places are going to become like uninhabitable desert wastelands or something. That it seems like human activity continues to be mass migration towards warm, sunny places. And perhaps this is a consequence of air conditioning, making that's, I can't imagine living in Arizona without air conditioning, but obviously people did for a very long time, though at much lower population density than now. And with obviously the way that water works now is a lot different too. But that's what I'm curious about. It doesn't, like what you're describing sounds very apocalyptic about the place where I live, but no one here is acting at all as though you're saying present tense, there's a sort of apocalyptic situation unfolding. That doesn't seem at all to be how anyone is behaving. People travel here in the summer. We have lots of tourists who come here in the summer because it's so pleasant. And in British Columbia, as I said, you're having more and more people moving to the Vancouver area, to southern British Columbia, and no, as far as I can tell, no big movement of people north in the territory.
May I just jump in briefly quick before you answer on the timescales, Ilan? I think there's something to, this is me speaking as a qualitative sociologist now, there's certainly a disconnect between like most people's understanding of climate science and their lived experience of their daily lives. And most people are not going to attribute these changes to something like climate change or like resource use or like the Industrial Revolution. You know what I mean? People aren't going to be like, I mean, if I think about my grandma who lives in Phoenix, you know, if I started talking to her about how like precarious her life is there and how it's based on air conditioning, which it is, and how it's based on, you know, like the energy grid continuing to work, which it is, she would be like, I don't care, or I don't want to talk about this. This is scaring me, or it, you know, it's like, it's how it's always been. It's fine. And so, you know, I think there is to some extent climate migration happening, but usually it's like the worst affected places and places where it's so extreme drought and people like have subsistence livelihoods and they can't live and they'll otherwise starve. It's like to that level where people start moving. Most of North America is mostly affluent still relatively and can buffer these things with their affluence to the, you know, to the extent that they're able to. But I am curious what you have to say, Ilan, about the time scale on these things too, because I get a lot of, I teach a homesteading class where people are trying to do some home production, home gardening, this kind of thing. And some people are open to moving wherever in the world or in the United States. And they ask, like, where should I go? What should I be thinking about? And they are concerned about climate change. And in some ways, I give them, all the websites I know about, but then there's also a lot of question marks, like, I don't actually know how it's going to turn out in British Columbia. I don't know exactly. I can't say with certainty that your grandchildren will have X climate. You know what I mean? If you move there and settle there, it's hard to know exactly. So, that kind of thing. I think the uncertainty part is where, I don't know, it's partially what I'm interested in, but maybe part of Donald's question too. There's like the data question, the uncertainty, and also the time scale it's hard for people to think in these time scales, I think, too.
And that leads to the fundament in response to Donald's points that people migrate for many reasons. And at the moment, they are not migrating because of climate change. Whether they have a choice or a force, at no point did I ever say people are moving because of human-caused climate change. We've looked for it, and in general, we do not find it. What is happening is that they are dying in heat and humidity, not in the tens of thousands, not in the hundreds of thousands, but the death toll in British Columbia was 600. Some of those, not all of them, some of those were climate change. It's the same going on in Europe at the moment and in India, Pakistan. The death toll will be in the hundreds, maybe the thousands, some, not all, attributable to climate change. So yeah, Canadians move to Florida and Arizona in the winter. That's why they're called snowbirds. They go back to Canada in the summer, and they are not moving because they're thinking of climate change. They are moving because they're thinking of the climate, and they want to avoid cold, they want to avoid snow. So as long as they can go from the air-conditioned apartments to their air-conditioned cars to their air-conditioned shopping malls and restaurants, whether it's 90 Fahrenheit or 120 Fahrenheit, doesn't matter to them. So no, they're not moving because of climate change, and they're not thinking about climate change. But if that air conditioning goes out for a week when it's in the triple digits, then they're going to die. And they're not thinking about that. Should they? That's a different question. The issue is not making assumptions about what we're saying, because no, I never said that people are moving because of climate change. On the issue of moving from hot areas to cold areas, we actually do see it happening in Scandinavia. So climate change is making resource extraction in the high north much more amenable. Opportunities are being created or opening up, and we are seeing so-called climate change migrants, which, as you know, as I've said, it's not something I necessarily support, but we are seeing people moving north in Scandinavia due to climate change affecting people's expectations, and I keyword expectations, of what jobs and livelihoods will be available. Another example of equatorial to mid-latitudes or northern latitudes movement is what we're seeing right now for Europe, where people are coming from hot climates, such as many places around equatorial Africa, many places in North Africa, as well as the Middle East, like Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and they're moving from these hot climates to colder climates, such as Northern Europe. Is this linked to climate change? Absolutely not. People migrate for many reasons: north, south, east, west, east, north, south, southeast, to north, northwest, or whatever. Migration is a human condition. A lot voluntary, some seasonal, like the snowbirds, some permanent. And there's also snowbirds in China, actually. There are places in southern China where northerners are trying to escape the winter. So they buy second properties or they move permanently to the south, and they're starting to displace the locals in southern China. People always move for many reasons, and that includes hot climates to cold climates like we're seeing, but there is absolutely no attribution that we can find related to climate change for the movements from North Africa, Central Africa, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. They are moving for many other reasons. At the same time that many Europeans migrate too. The UK left the European Union. A lot of European Union citizens have migrated from the UK back to the European Union. No link whatsoever to climate change. They're making those migration decisions for other reasons, as are all the people we mentioned. So we must be so careful not to conflate, number one, climate change is happening and we're causing it, to number two, people are moving because of climate change, because that number two is not something that we can show at the moment.
But do you think that like at some point in this, it has to start, if your understanding of the situation, and not just your understanding, but this apparent scientific, not quite consensus, I guess. There's some that not quite consensus, but at some point it has to start affecting mass human behavior.
Why?
Presumably.
Why?
If as you described, the place where I live is going to be uninhabitably hot, and places north of me are going to be habitable and pleasant, then presumably there would be, at some point, be humans would respond to that.
Well, there's different options. So some will move, some will die, some will move locally, because exactly as you said, talking about wide-scale climate doesn't always match a local experience. Maybe you can move up a mountain slope. Maybe you can plant trees and take 20 degrees Fahrenheit off the local temperature. Or maybe you can afford and are able to build artificial cooling, a combination of natural ventilation, maybe something related to heat pumps, maybe using ocean water or other forms of water, and you can barricade yourself and have a cool dwelling without being reliant on the national or subnational electricity grid. So people have different options, but one of the elements that we're going to see is people will not think about it until it's too late and they are going to die. And others have the affordability to adapt in many different ways at the expense of others. So to say there will be one human response is not what the science supports. These people are different. They have different levels of assets, different levels of knowledge and of choices and of power and of opportunities, and they're going to respond differently.
I just want to share a brief anecdote here. This past summer in Uruguay, we had a heat wave, and it was, I think it was up to like 113, 14 Fahrenheit. And there was a climate scientist, I forget his Twitter handle, who posted this picture. This heat wave is coming to Argentina and Uruguay. And somebody tagged me in it and said like, oh, Ashley, watch out, be careful. And I said like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know this was happening. And so then I was, thinking about it and it was coming. And I responded to the climate scientist, what should I do to prepare? And his response was, there's nothing you can do to prepare when the wet bulb temperatures are above X, whatever. And I was saying, well, couldn't I, like spend time outside, go in the shade? We have these giant walnut trees, go into our pool and let the evaporation cool me off, this kind of thing. He said like, no, there's nothing you can do. And I just felt like that is such a weird thing to say to somebody who's about to experience this. So anyways, couple of days came, and I brought my thermometer outside, just because I was kind of annoyed by the guy's response, and I just showed the difference between the shade.
This is really good. That was,
yes.
Actually, we missed what you just said.
Oh, what? Where did you lose me?
Something about water evaporation and and then how weird it was that you didn't think you could do anything.
Okay, so then I thought that was a really weird response. So then the day came, and I was kind of annoyed by that response, because I'm just a human living in this place who's going to experience this thing. There's something I can do. So then I was being annoying, I admit, but I brought my thermometer outside and showed the difference of the temperature in the shade versus the sun, and was just like tweeting all day and tagging the guy and saying like, it's awful. I believe in it. I know that this is all happening, but also there is some agency in the world, and you don't have to just be like, I might as well just roll over and die because that's going to be 113 degrees. Like, what I did is the best I could possibly do in the situation. And so I do think there is kind of like there's a complicated nuance here with the climate change stuff. There's, on the one hand, it's important to realize that these things are happening as a call to action, or to you know, something is happening, and what it is might be narrow to temperature or humidity, but it's still happening, and we more or less understand the causes, you know, from greenhouse gases. What we do about it, though, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, is where all the interesting things happen. You know, we're humans, we're going to live.
You're using technical vocabulary, adaptation, mitigation.
So, you know, how we live, how we survive, you know,
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Despite all of this potential change, humans have adapted through different climate periods, including an ice age. And so, you know, so I don't know if, Donald, you had a plan to bring it back around, but I'm curious if we can turn a little bit towards the optimism, towards the action. Donald, did you have a?
Yeah, I guess that my questions about human migration were shifting towards like human response or human action. And I guess this is another place where the disconnect, that human action necessarily occurs in a particular place. Like there is no such thing as global action, or aside from, I suppose, like a nuclear warfare or something, like anything that is capable, like the crazy people who talk about like shooting stuff into the air to, I'm not exactly sure what the idea is, to then reflect the sun to cool that seems, I don't read much science fiction, but I read enough to know that's probably going to have catastrophic unintended consequences. But so human action occurs in a particular place. Human level action occurs in a particular place. And Ilan, you've said a few times, like, well, let's just not use this term climate if it's getting in the way. And so I'm curious about what the actual effect of climate thinking has been in terms of human action. Like, has it actually, you hear these stories about people being having all kinds of psychological distress.
The Doomers.
Hearing about this, that my wife works is a therapist, so she hears stories about this from her own work, and then from her other coworkers' work, young people who are just sort of spiral into anxiety and depression related to this kind of thing, or people choosing not to have children. You hear that. I'm not sure how real that is, but it seems to be at least somewhat real. And then you have a huge flood of money to NGOs and scientists who seem to spend that on like raising awareness and like propagating research about these kind of things. And it seems to me that that all of this, it almost, not necessarily, but almost necessarily pushes people towards inaction, because describing things on the scale that it does, it's impossible for anyone to act on that scale. So if I never met, and I guess I don't think about climate in the way that you two do, but I can think about, like water, soil,
Mm-hmm.
like air, things I can
touch
around me. And actually see, like the Nooksack River here. It's an interesting question. The flooding of the Nooksack River, and people want to dredge it, but then that would be terrible for the salmon. And these sorts of are the kind of ecological things that I think about in the place where I live, that I probably can't do anything about the Nooksack River, but I can at least sort of grasp what's going on, and presumably be part of doing something about it. Versus with global climate, you put, it's impossible for me to act on that scale, for any human to act on that scale. And so politically, it seems terrible. Like even if I were to break out of whatever like localist mindset I have that makes, and so I was actually able to conceive of the things you're talking about, which I'm still having trouble with. It seems to me politically that it's like very dangerous and sort of destructive, in that it removes agency from people and just makes them despair on the one hand, and on the other hand shifts so many resources to like large global nonprofits and government agencies and so on, which I think, even if well-intentioned, act on a scale that is sort of inherently destructive.
I'll just add one detail to that question. I think it's called the Agder program. It's a Gates Foundation funded program in Africa that's climate smart agriculture that basically is just removing peasant, small scale agroecological farmers from their land in favor of like industrial, mechanized, climate smart, which means measurable agriculture, because there's a way in which subsistence agriculture isn't measurable in the same way that mechanized, standardized, efficient, but same agriculture, the agriculture of, you know, some standard set of practices can be measured. And it's just failed miserably in terms of yields even, and it's just used huge amounts of chemical inputs and tilling agriculture and et cetera, et cetera. Like this is a real world consequence of like climate smart thinking, not to say that that's the consequence that's always happening with regard to you know, climate change related policy, but it's one that's just like on a huge scale across an entire continent in the name of climate change, doing the opposite of what we need ecologically. But I'm curious.
And it removes local agency. And I think, Ashley, you may have interviewed this guy, and I forget his name, but he's doing things in Africa and other places with like mangroves and
Neil Spackman.
Neil Spackman, where, so to give, you know, it's not everyone who believes in climate change is evil. Neil Spackman is definitely like a climate focused person, but his whole thing is doing regenerative agriculture practices that local people
can be involved,
are doing themselves, are 100% involved in. And it's pretty brilliant, his thing, where it was like a closed, it was like a permaculture cycle.
Aquaculture, mangrove.
Yeah, it was like shrimp farms and mangrove forest. And anyway, a whole cycle. It was pretty brilliant in that the people living there were able just to run it themselves, because it was on a scale that was an actual human scale. So anyway, it's not that everyone who believes and like climate stuff is like Bill Gates or whatever, but there seems to be something that's linked, like thinking on the scale that global climate requires seems to lend itself to attempted action on that scale, or inaction in the face of something that's so beyond human experience.
Great question.
Yeah, what you're both saying resonates. Climate smart means nothing to me. Does it mean anything to you?
Not really. I mean, a little bit. I mean, I think if I think climate smart for my own operation, which is 9-acre homestead, I think like I want to have better soil, water retention. You know, I want to have more trees for shade. Like if I just am like if I'm generally thinking what comes to mind when I say climate smart for myself, but it's all the same stuff I want to do for ecological health on my land anyways, with water and soil and everything.
Donald, does climate smart mean anything to you?
It brings to mind, to the extent it means anything, it doesn't mean anything good.
Sensors, robots.
Yeah.
So people throw out all these ridiculous phrases. And it's what you said at the beginning of this sort of part, that does climate thinking cause problems? And yes, it does. Climate is an artificial statistical construct. It's not tangible, it's not there. And so focusing everything on climate change is number one, wrong, because not everything is climate or climate change. And number two, distracts from what we can do as individuals in our place, as well as the basic issues which we have to address. We are using too many resources. We are overexploiting nature and people. We have to think about stabilizing the population in an ethical manner. And all of those lead to many symptoms, one of which is human-caused climate change. Others are overfishing, massive forest destruction, massive ecosystem destruction, human slavery, organ trafficking. Those are all symptoms of this fundamental cause that we are simply consuming too much. And so I fully agree with you. How can we grasp climate thinking? How can we implement climate smart for ourselves when they don't make sense? So I'm with you.
So some years ago, I saw David Suzuki, I believe his name is, a famous Canadian environmentalist. He gave a talk at my alma mater. And I remember in the talk, he said, this is almost a word for word quote, because it was so harrowing to me. He praised China's, quote, heroic one-child policy as a kind of model for
the world.
And so, of course, this is a like mass forced abortion, sterilization, thing that total destruction of human life and culture. I think so. You said something about ethical populations. So I don't think you're in the. But I guess that's we have decreasing birth rates globally, and that's another part of the climate thing. Is it the climate as a main topic of sort of scientific environmental focus came on the heels of like population bomb and overpopulation being a major focus, and that's receded in the last decades, mostly because none of the predictions came true, and because actually the opposite has happened. But it always makes me very wary that there seems to be implicit, again, and I'm not saying this about you specifically, but that humans are the problem, that humans are a negative, and that you sort of take the thinking to its logical conclusion. It's that what really needs to happen is for there to be fewer humans, or if humans are just out of the picture, then the climate, everything would be great. Great for whom? It's then it becomes like, what is even the point at that point? But I think paradoxically, it's like the fact that humans are not, to use the low term, most people are further and further away from any exploitation of nature now. That we consume the after effects of that. But fewer and fewer people, at least in the United States, are actually involved in farming, logging, fishing, mining. We just consume the products of it as more and more mechanized, and also people are having fewer people are having children, and people are having fewer children, other than the Amish, and in both those cases, like we move more towards abstraction, have less or less and less forced to actually encounter reality in the way that you're forced to encounter reality when you're growing food, or chopping down trees, or pulling minerals out of the ground, or raising children. And I might be extrapolating too much, but in my mind, like climate thinking is part of that, like move towards abstraction and move away from, directly wrestling with nature.
I've never supported a one-child policy, and China no longer has it. The key is it does have to be ethical. As you're saying, birth rates are declining, and that's interesting. You throw out a global statistic, which is fair enough.
Sure.
We can talk about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's good. That's numbers. A good.
I think to say that the population bomb predictions or projections never came true the response could be because people took them on board and changed. So had that book not been written, had they not been screaming and yelling about the rates of consumption, maybe no one would have done anything, as opposed to raising the issue at that time period, which led to people thinking about it, responding, and doing much better.
So you think people should be having fewer children?
I think it's not for me to tell people what they should do. What we do know is that we are over-consuming. One element of overconsumption is the number of people. By advocating for reduced population, we end up with all these ethical challenges, but by not advocating it, we end up with all the ethical challenges. So how do we achieve ethical approaches to population stabilization? What we generally find is giving better education, seeking equity and equality. People then make their own decisions for their own reasons in such a way that we tend to consume less and also have a generally declining birth rates. Part of it is what you said, fewer people having children and people having fewer children. Part of it is also having children later in life. So rather than having 2 or 3 kids by the age of 20, if you just start at the age of 30, that has significant impacts on the change, the population growth rate or declining rate. So when we talk about equity and equality, when we talk about choices, when we talk about education, it's giving people access to contraception. It's making appropriate abortion available. It's having sex education and having open conversations in a mature professional manner about sexuality, sex, relationships, and intimacy, so that people have the choices, know they're not going to be judged by their intimate behavior, and ensuring that women and men have equivalent say, have equivalent control, and we're not putting moral stipulations on people who decide to behave in a certain way or otherwise. So what should people do regarding kids? That's not for me to say. It is for me to say, and I hope everyone will join me, that we want a more equitable and equal world. We want everyone to have appropriate access to education for many, many years. And what we find is, as a consequence, we move towards ethical population stabilization because people have the choices, the resources, and the power to accept what happens to their bodies, accept what happens to their intimacies, and accept what happens to their relationships in family and non-family contexts, with all the knock-on effects in terms of these issues of who's having kids, how many kids, and at what age.
My quick response on the population question is also how important it is to understand like certain populations' consumption rate versus others. And there's like a very weird thing that happens with global population numbers, and then people's mind always goes to the people who have the highest replacement fertility, which are the people who are the lowest consumers on the planet in general right now. So it just becomes this very weird thing, as opposed to like maybe thinking about people in the global north who consume way above their ecologically sustainable rates, partially mostly as a responsive or as a result of power relations, global power relations, being able to consume at that level. And instead what happens is the focus goes to the poorest and least consuming people on the planet. We're almost out of time. I want to just say one other thing and get your response, Ilan. I think there's something really significant in what Donald is pointing out here, which is I think there are basically two worldviews that seem to be competing for that determine how we think about solutions. One that I think is held by a lot of people who are concerned with global climate change and look at global climate change numbers regularly, sees abstractions, does see humans, if you sort of make your mind all about these abstractions and these large scale numbers, the inevitable conclusion is that humans are the problem. Humans, basically breathing is the problem when you come down to it. It's like you're breathing out all this carbon dioxide, and everything you do is consuming. You're inherently destructive, and therefore lots of very strange and in some ways immoral, like the project in Africa I was talking about. I would call that immoral from my perspective. Behaviors result. On the other hand, and the idea is that humans should basically be separate from nature. We should let nature rewild, and we should use all the efficiencies possible to just give humans their basic necessities at the lowest possible level of consumption, and let nature, be separate. Another way of thinking that tends to, the people on this podcast tend to have, which is that humans do have the ability to have a positive impact on the environment. Thinking about like Neil Spackman or Vandana Shiva, who we've had on, these kinds of people who think about and enact in their daily lives humans as a keystone species that can have a positive impact, that can be embedded in their environment and doing things day to day. And this is my life is learning how to do this myself with my hands. I mean, I can change the health of the soil of my land through management practices myself. Ashley, who I grew up in Chicago. I don't know anything, but I could do it. I read a couple books and I can do it through like planting trees and managing livestock in a certain way. It's actually unbelievable, people's power. And I think the alternative point of view that I'm generally trying to put forth is one in which humans can be a positive force, where we do have some agency, that there are limitations on our agency from environmental problems, including climate, but not limited to climate. But we can do so much, and we have such a capacity if we change our perspective to think about our power and agency. So I'm curious
this is exactly it. No, this is exactly it. And this is why it's not just population numbers. It's what we do with people. It's what people do. In terms of the stance that we can just separate ourselves from nature and rewild, that's not scientifically supportable. We are part of the planet. We are using nature, the environment every day, and we interact with it. It is unavoidable. So to call for separation, to say, well, we can just partition ourselves, it's not realistic. It's not scientific. It's not going to happen. So it's exactly what you're articulating, and Donald's experience too, in terms of how we're going to live with the environment in such a way that we have a good quality of life, but we're not destroying ourselves, others, or the ecosystems. And yeah, it's all very well to say that actually the people with the highest population growth rate are those who consume the least, but look at their life expectancy, look at their health, look at their opportunities for livelihoods and jobs, look at the quality of life. Is that what we really want?
Right.
And my answer is I'm quite enjoying a conversation via Zoom, which requires a huge level of affluence comparatively, and having life expectancy to get to a certain age to retire, and then to enjoy retirement for a while. To know that if I get sick, I can go to a doctor and hopefully get healed, as opposed to, oh, you have a bit of illness, okay, you're probably dead. So there are certain things which
we can reach a basic level of affluence with this, humans as part of the ecosystem way of thinking. I generally do. Yes. And that's because I have this podcast called Doomer Optimism, but I actually do. The more I talk to people who do ecological work, the more I realize like how resilient ecosystems can be if we change the way we interact with them.
Of course we can, but not with the current population numbers. But nor am I advocating genocide, nor am I advocating a one-child policy. It's about ethically and appropriately giving people the options through more equitable and equal approaches to ensure that people are making that choices and doing so with resources, with the power, working locally, working across continents as we're doing today. We've 3 continents on this call.
That's true.
That's 3 out of 3. In order to simply do better for ourselves and the planet. But that's not separation, nor is it ecosystem destruction. It's not saying that we're superior to nature, nor is it saying we're inferior to nature. It's saying that we are looking for a certain planet with our species in line with the wider ecosystems and people around us, our local communities and our global communities, in order to ensure that we are living safe and healthy lives with, not against, or separate from nature and the environment.
I would just add, and I want to.
Could I say one?
Donald
Okay,
had the
go
last
ahead.
word. I just want to say not just population, but consumption levels. Like
Yeah.
right now, we're shipping things across the world that make no sense to do. That kind of thing, like, is completely unnecessary. We could localize a lot of production, you know, that kind of thing. So it's not just population, it's population and consumption. I would just add. But Donald, you can go ahead. Sorry, you could have the last word. Let's wrap it up.
It's just fascinating to listen to this, because like my vision of what I want the place where I live to move towards is people having a lot more children. And I think that a future in which people are way more people are actively involved in producing things, in food, textiles, wood, and so on, requires large families. There's just no way to move to have, whether it's a small farm future, though I always say actually in my county, in the county south of me, we have a small farm present, the very agricultural. Outside of the city I live in, the rest of my county and the county south of me, very agricultural, and just the geography of the place doesn't allow for large farms. I don't know, 100-acre farm maybe is a large farm here, which now in the United States is tiny, right? Mm-hmm. You have these thousands and thousands of acres of corn and soybeans, but in other places. So I kind of live in a small farm present. I'm not a farmer, so I have no pretensions in that direction. But in order for that to exist socially, like the social as a way of life, it's people having a bunch of children, and that's the world I want to live in. I want to live in a world of fecundity for sure, and I think that you know, as delicious as they are, yeah, it doesn't make any sense for us to be eating Peruvian berries and so on. And you know, there's at least here, like the potential for growing is almost infinite compared to where we are now in terms of what can be produced per acre. And that seems to be the equation that regenerative agriculture proposes, is much higher yields per acre, but much lower yield per person. So requiring a lot more human labor, but then each acre producing way more. So versus, you know, a small group of farmers on giant tractors can produce like calories per person, huge amounts on these gigantic farms, but the yield per acre are much worse than an intensive like sort of permaculture, regenerative agriculture, 2-acre homestead, which can be producing a huge amount of calories in those 2 acres, but requiring way more human labor to produce it. But that sort of culture of human labor producing things just necessarily involves lots of people.
Well, it does involve young people, especially. I mean, like
young people, it has to.
If you want a small farm future where people are involved in, even if it's not just as farmers, as regenerative farmers, but even small scale production outside the home, you know, that kind of thing, it's not really necessarily going to be tended by a 60-year-old plus type, you know, where the average age, it just keeps going up and up in the US. I think it's a legit question. I don't want to, that's like a whole other can of worms though. And
it's a whole other thing.
Yeah. And we're at,
but thank you for bearing with me, both of you.
Yeah. So Ilan, anything else? Where can we follow you? Thank you so much for doing this. I think it will be really helpful and instructive to people. Where can we follow
appreciate
you?
The opportunity. It's been a wonderful conversation, and these are the questions we need, particularly when at the end we didn't mention that C word, climate, because we're really dealing with the baselines and completely bypassing these strange abstract concepts, which I fully understand don't have a lot of meaning. But if we do solve these baselines, then by definition, we actually deal with the climate change challenges that we have. But please get involved in the conversation. Of course, I don't know everything. Of course, I make errors, like the real error, not the mathematical error I mentioned earlier. So please connect on Twitter, via Instagram, via LinkedIn, or other social media. Tell me what I can learn. Tell me how I can improve, and we can move forward together in order to create that better world that we all want.
Beautiful. All right, I will let you both go. Thank you so much for participating. Yeah, we'll see you on social media.
Thank you,
Thanks for the
Ashley.
opportunity.
All right, have a good
Great
one.
to meet you, Donald.
Bye-bye.